Yeah, James, there's a lot more coming out in these books, isn't there? What are your reflections on the Scott Morrison we're starting to learn about?
Well, my experience with Scott Morrison is what you see is what you get. He behaves the same way with his colleagues, privately, off-air, as you see him behave in a television interview or out in the community campaigning in the election. I participated in the documentary that went to air last week, and I spoke to Niki Savva for her book because I was a participant in those historic events, and I think it's important...
A Dutton supporter initially?
Yep, I was, and I think it's important that people who do participate in those events make sure that the truth comes out about those events, because I think they're a legitimate matter of the historical record.
So do you think Niki Savva is getting to the truth? Because we heard, and we've heard this from other sources incidentally, that Scott Morrison's backers voted for Peter Dutton, or many of them, in the first spill to inflate his numbers and make sure that Malcolm Turnbull's position was terminal. If that's the case, could Morrison not have known about it?
Well, what I was going to say, Tony, is that, as you pointed out, that I was a Peter Dutton supporter at the time, and I completed both of those interviews prior to the election result being known, so I had no knowledge that we would have won the election, that he'd be Prime Minister. I wasn't critical of Scott Morrison or his supporters then, and I'm not today. I think they acted with integrity throughout that week. They did what all of us in that party room tried to do, which is to put the best interests of the party, the government and the country first, and to make a difficult decision. It was a difficult week for everyone involved, but ultimately I think we've landed in the right place, as the election has shown.
So you would have seen the famous footage of Scott Morrison after the first spill putting his arm around Malcolm Turnbull and saying, this is my leader and I'm very ambitious for him. Was he ambitious for his future back in the private sector?
Well, at that point, Malcolm Turnbull was still the Prime Minister, and the signatures required to have a new party room meeting on Friday hadn't yet been gathered. It wasn't clear what was going to happen there, and I believe that Scott Morrison was supporting the Prime Minister as he said he was.
But his supporters were not. You accept that?
Well, some of them might have been going out and campaigning, but I think they did so because they believed that change was necessary. And like every other member of the party room, they had their same right to put forward their concerns, to communicate that with their colleagues and to seek the change that they thought was necessary.
So do you agree that as the Prime Minister contends, his election victory effectively wipes away all of these questions about how he became Prime Minister?
Tony, I served briefly in our first term, for the entirety of our second term and now in our third term. And in my time in politics, I've never seen a Liberal Prime Minister with the authority and goodwill that Scott Morrison has. Because he won an election that so many expected that he would not, he has incredible authority within the party room, and we've changed our leadership rules in a way that makes his leadership more secure than any Liberal Prime Minister before him. So yes, I think we will move on from this. A lot of the participants in that have left the Parliament voluntarily, and there's a real new determination and unity in the government to move forward and to deliver for the Australian people, as we promised we would in the campaign.
Go to James Paterson to hear the government's perspective on this. What's the problem with splitting these tax cuts? Let the lower end of the income spectrum get their tax cuts straight away with Labor support, and worry about those a number of years down the track, worry about them later.
Because, Tony, it's a comprehensive tax reform plan. It proposes, as Clare says rightly, immediate relief for low and medium income earners, but also like things that people like Greg are calling for, which is some long-term tax reform as well. I think it's critically important that, under our plan, 94% of taxpayers will face a marginal rate of tax of no greater than 30 cents on the dollar. That means if you're earning anywhere from $45,000 a year up to $200,000 a year, you'll face no greater than 30 cents on the dollar. You won't face any artificial disincentives to taking on more hours, working harder, taking risks, starting a business. You'll be incentivised to do that. That's really important for our medium and long-term economic growth. But it's very clear from Clare's comments tonight that the Labor Party has learned nothing from the last election. They might have changed leaders, they might have changed their rhetoric a little bit, but their policies are the same. The war on aspiration that they took to the last election, they are continuing with today. They're standing in the way of tax relief for Australian people.
Can we be honest, though, about what the coalition want to happen right now at a political level? The coalition want Labor to vote against it. That's why they're keeping this all together. No, sorry, hold on a moment, because you've talked quite a bit and I haven't. There are three tranches here. Labor has shifted their position and said, you guys have a mandate, you took this to an election, and people said they wanted these tax cuts. So we're going to shift a bit and we're going to give you the first two tranches. Now, you could vote them through, push them through the Parliament immediately, come back a week later and start talking about that third stage, and you could help people out at the first point. All that Labor's said is that they are recognising that our economy is in trouble, that it is moving very, very quickly, and maybe we shouldn't put in major tax reform that isn't going to take effect for 5 or 6 years and make a decision about that now. On top of that, I think we need to take into account the budget that is currently in place, which is a budget that the Coalition took in an election year they were expecting to lose. And it is a budget based on a whole bunch of fairy tale assumptions around population growth, around economic growth and around wages growth that are not going to happen.
James, first of all, can I just put one thing to you, because you may not need Labor's support at all if you can get the crossbench support for the full package in the Senate. Will that happen? You're pretty close to that argument, I'd say, being in the Senator.
The truth is I don't know, Tony. We're hopeful that all non-government senators see the light and recognise our mandate and support the tax cuts, contrary to Jamila's prediction that we don't want that. I assure you I desperately want them to vote for them and as soon as possible. But I have to say this new concern of the Labor Party of the long-term budget implications is not something that they showed when they were in government when it came to spending. Because when they were in government and they came to spending, they signed the country up and the government up to tens of billions of dollars of spending in perpetuity with no end date, with no concern as to what the future budget impact of that might be. So it's a bit convenient to say now that we're considering tax cuts, we have to be only short term and we couldn't possibly commit for the long term.
But you are committing to the long term. The next tranche, or the last tranche in a few years' time, is $95 billion from the budget. That's quite a big commitment when you're not sure whether your revenue is going to be under stress from a slowing economy.
It's big reform, Tony, and we make no bones about that. We're very proud of the fact that it is big tax reform, because that's what this country needs.
So is the theory, the economic theory, that it'll all trickle down, it'll create stimulus, and in fact that will benefit the economy, which is flagging?
No, the trickle-down economics is a political epithet. It's not an economic theory. What we're actually proposing, Tony, is something that was set out in the budget very carefully and based on very prudent, conservative assumptions.
Do you know there's a really good, prudent assumption that Australia's birth rate is going to rise to 1.9 in 3 years? That assumption's been in the Coalition's budget papers for the last 4 years. It's not budged. People are having less babies, not more. But it's really helpful for the budget bottom line if you boost it up.
You've forgotten Peter Costello came out and convinced people to have more children, and they actually did.
At least he had a policy to try and get them to have more children. These guys just think it's going to happen.
Well, give them a week. We'll see what happens. James Paterson, the legislation failed once. Tell us about the legislation, first of all, and because that was what the question was about originally. And will it be put again, and will that happen soon?
In a perfect world, Tony, you wouldn't need something like an ensuring integrity bill, because the union movement would police itself. Even notwithstanding the events of the conviction of last week, prior to that, John Setka had been convicted 59 times of a range of offences, including assaulting a police officer. And until last week, until a couple of weeks ago, no one in the union movement thought that was a problem. No one thought that that was an issue. No one thought he should be expelled from the Labor Party or removed from the CFMEU. They thought that was all fine and merry and he should just continue. And there are 70 other officials of the CFMEU alone who are currently before the courts on other matters.
So briefly, in the Setka case, would the legislation disallow him from running a union?
What the legislation would do is establish a fit and proper person test. It recognises the fact, as Grace mentioned earlier, that union leaders have special legal privileges that other Australians don't have. And in order to get those legal privileges, you've got some responsibilities too. One of those is a respect for the law, respect for people that you're dealing with. It's not acceptable, as John Setka did, to threaten the families and children of public servants at the Australian Building and Construction Commission just for doing their jobs.
So what's the answer? Would that fit and proper test effectively be powerful enough to prevent a union leader with that kind of record remaining a union leader?
In the case of John Setka, it would be open and shut case, surely.
Okay, James, what do you think?
Tony, I recently became a dad for the first time. My wife and I have a 7-month-old boy, and we'll be raising him that every human being is of equal value and equal worth and deserving of equal respect, and that we'll expect him to behave that way when he grows up. And I think that's the best thing that any parent can do to make sure that their sons and daughters behave in a way that you'll be proud of when you see them grow up.
James, what do you think? And Well, there's two things to... Actually, you should reflect, first of all, on that question that was asked, and I'll bring you back to the one that Grace answered.
Thank you, Tony. And I should say at the outset, I'm agnostic. I don't believe anyone's going to hell, but I do think that freedom of religion and freedom of speech are absolutely central freedoms in a free, liberal society like Australia's. I thought one of the best contributions made this week is from a Labor figure, a lawyer, Josh Bornstein, who asked the question, in this country, do we want corporations to set what their employees can do in their own private terms and the limits of their speech? And how far do we want that to go?
Do you include
because as you point that out,
churches?
Well, I'm coming to exactly that, Tony. Because as you point out, on this occasion, it is a social conservative in Israel, Folau, who's on the receiving end of this. But it's equally plausible to imagine that someone who works for a private company or a church or a school who has left-leaning attitudes is also the victim of this kind of action in the future. And I think as a country we will be poorer if everybody who works for a private organisation, through their employment contracts, has such oppressive contract conditions that they can't speak themselves freely in public debate. I think we'll be worse off as a society if that's the road we go down.
Now, very briefly, do you accept the point that Grace is making, that this case will not rise to a major test case on freedom of religion because it's actually constrained within an employment law context?
I partly agree with Grace. It certainly is a contract dispute, but it's taken on much wider implications and it is of great concern to
as public debate, but in law.
But as it should, though, because, Tony, when you see someone who's prominent, who you're used to seeing playing football on the weekend, lose his promising contract and career as a result of something he said that's based on his genuinely held faith, of course that's of concern to Australians. And Australians are going to expect that the Parliament comes and deals with this in some way after this case is finished.
All right. James, and I'll get you to focus on the ABC part of that, or the public broadcasting part of that question at least. In the knowledge that since 2014 you've been suggesting the ABC should be privatised.
In my previous life at the IPA, not in my current life as a senator.
Oh, so they were views you no longer hold?
That's right, that's right. Tony, I'm very happy to take this question because I didn't see Kerry O'Brien's speech live, but I heard it replayed on the radio this afternoon. And it was like he was playing ABC opinion bingo card. He literally ticked off every predictable ABC opinion, one after the other. And this is one of the problems that so many Australians have with the ABC and with the public broadcaster. And that is that the opinions are so predictable, they're so often left-wing, and many Australians of a liberal and conservative outlook don't get a look in on this ABC. And
so can I just ask you, Tony, is it left-wing or right-wing to worry about the ABC funding cuts, which have had a profound, and I say this just as a fact, have had a profound impact on the ABC's morale, on its future planning, and what it will ultimately do with the money that it gets. And we're going to see a lot of job losses as a result of those cuts. They will come. Do these things matter, and are they left-wing or right-wing concerns?
Well, Tony, I'm just picking up the concern that the chair of the ABC board, Ida Buttrose, has aired, that your managing director has aired, which the ABC does have a bias problem, they've both admitted. But I also take up a point also made by Ida, which is that funding reductions for the ABC need not necessarily result in job losses. She presumably knows more about the ABC budget than you or I do. I'll take her at her word. But also, let's have a bit of a reality check about the ABC's budget compared to the budget of every other media organisation in this country. The ABC is exceptionally well funded, generously, by $1 billion a year of taxpayers' money. Every other media organisation in this country has had much more savage cuts than the ABC will ever face. So I don't ever celebrate anyone losing a job. That's not a good thing, but let's put it in perspective.
Okay, Jamila.
Wow.
I'll quickly go back to James' final word on this, and because we basically are over time, but you can't obviously advocate privatisation anymore because that's against government policy, and you've anyway recanted your previous position. But what about merging the public broadcasters, because that's another thing that's been on the agenda? Is that something the government will look at, and would you encourage them to do so?
No, I'm sceptical about that. I think the ABC and SBS play different roles and are different organisations and have different cultures and very different legislation. As you know, the SBS is permitted to take advertising, the ABC is not. So I can't see how a merger would work, and I'm not advocating that.
And as for the future of the ABC, do you think we'll get the funding back?
You continue to be generously well funded by taxpayers, Tony.
All right. We had to try, didn't we? That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Clare O'Neill, Greg Day, Grace Kelly, Jamila Rizvi and James Paterson.